simply got the bishop there to write to Rome and say bluntly, if you want a school, we've got to charge tuition. There is no way we can support the place. That came as a terrible surprise to them. And somewhat reluctantly, the bishop was willing, that went to the Congregation for Propagation of the Faith, and back from them after some time came a very short, maybe 3-4 lines, positive. The school of the society, the St. Louis University and its other schools are allowed to charge tuition until times get better. On that document, until 1966, when we changed the constitutions, every school of the Society of Jesus in the entire world relied canonically for the right to charge tuition. That was number one that we had to do. Number two, we came up against, as I said, the anti-Catholicism endemic in the whole culture of American English Protestantism. You know the famous series of letters between Adams and Jefferson, in which Adams lamented the existence of the Society of Jesus in the United States. It's a very bad thing. I wish it were not the case. They are a real peril to our liberty. But we've got to put up with them because our Constitution says we have to. And they did. But that didn't keep people furiously with anti-Catholic prejudices from being very reluctant to let the society continue or the church continue its work. In those circumstances, we had to tread sometimes very boldly, as with the schools, sometimes very cautiously, especially in what does the church teach? How do you get across to people the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, people inured to anti-Catholicism, in language that is understandable and acceptable by people who, at the beginning at least, were mostly missionaries who came from other countries. Didn't even speak the language when they came, and often enough imbued with the ideas of the European society in general, and the European church. It was a very small group, and as a result, the suspicion is too strong a word, the hesitation as to how we were going to live and how we were going to, especially how we were going to get the society going and be faithful to our own experiences in this country and faithful to what we thought was really the way the church and the society ought to operate if it was really in a flourishing Catholic society. It left some people with indeed a willingness to experiment, and we experimented greatly in this country. Not only the Jesuits, but others too. But a sort of a edgy back consciousness at the back of our heads. You know, are we really doing what we should do? Are we really living the life of the society as we ought? Are we really proclaiming the faith as we ought? A very instructive example, an Irish Jesuit was sent by the general as a visitor to this Missouri province early in its existence. Meantime, the general had been writing, for God's sake, what are you doing? Give the men at least, they're supposed to have 2 years novitiate, but if they can't have 2 years, give them at least 1 year novitiate. And if they can't all stay on the property during 1 year's novitiate, at least keep the ones who aren't priests on the property for 1 year's novitiate, get the others ordained and send them out to work. Well, the general did not like that, to say the least. He sent the visitor, Father Kenny was his name, a good man and very capable. The two big apostolates at the early time were the schools and the Indian missions, the Native Americans. We had a lot of people throughout the Jesuit provinces on that. When he finished his visitation, he told the superiors here in the Missouri province that they couldn't concentrate on both of them in equal measure. I mean, they just didn't have enough manpower and so on. So if they had to choose, they should choose the schools. And the interesting major reason he gave was not that that was the greater apostolate for the greater good, or it would do more to, spread the church and the society. No, it was because Jesuits could live a more strictly regimented religious community life in schools than they could on the Indian missions. That is a very interesting situation in which the life of the society, which is fundamentally communities are for the apostolate. They are not for themselves. Just as the church is not simply for itself, it's for the preaching of the gospel. But it was completely inverted. And for a long time, the way the rules were kept in the society itself, the way we conceived of ourselves and our apostolate and our lives was very conservative, much more conservative than you would have had it in other places. So were all of the other religious orders, for that matter. And through the 19th century, with such things as the syllabus of errors, or, for example, Gregory the 16th, talking about that stinking spring of indifference from which flow, or out of which flows that madness called freedom of conscience, where a person could choose his or her own religion. Putidus means smelly. Putidissimus can only be translated as stinking. That stinking source of indifference from which flows. Contrast that with Nostra Aetate from Vatican II. Well, nobody in this country was going to, Jesuits were going to believe that it was wrong practically to have people choose their own faith as they decided. But this document was on the books. So was the syllabus of errors of Pius IX, condemning in the last of 90 propositions that were condemned. The Pope should reconcile himself to liberty, freedom, and progress. That was condemned. And that was one of 90. What were you going to do with that kind of a thing? When you knew that that was not work in this country, when there was a certain divided consciousness, not conscience, but consciousness. The Jesuits are a supremely apostolic order, and in some ways a supremely pragmatic order. What works? What really makes, if you're going to preach the gospel, what do you have to do while maintaining its integrity to preach it and make it sensible, understandable to people? We're very much that way. Yes?
So John, I just have a question then. It's pragmatic, so was there any kind of planned sense that everything kind of starts with the University of St. Louis and all these other colleges, universities? Was there a sense of expansion, that they wanted to do this? Or was it kind of like, we're here, we've got this, can we do this? Okay, you can do this. So when you say pragmatic, was there any planning, I guess? The second question, I know that that women religious were in Florissant with the Jesuits right away. And was there a kind of an agreement with religious orders to kind of help us along?
Was there any planning? Overall, no. Partly because very early, the structure of the society divided itself into provinces, missions, and each of the provinces, Maryland and Missouri, later on, of course, Chicago, etc., did its own thing. There was no such thing as a national Jesuit Educational Association until way up into the 20th century. Was there overall planning? No. Even the superiors, the provincials of the provinces, did not meet on a regular basis together until way up into the 20th century. Did they know what each other were doing? Yes. Did they see the results of what the schools were doing? Yes. Were they overwhelmingly encouraged to continue those schools and to found new schools? Overwhelmingly, that was the case. That's the basis for whatever organized planning there was. Secondly, as far as women religious go, the old model of women, not just women religious, but women, they were either nuns or married, 16th, 17th century or so. Nuns are married or possibly prostitutes, or at the least, at the worst, in some senses, living at home unattached in their family until they grew old. The idea that there was anything like an external apostolate that they could do was absolutely forbidden. By the decrees of the Council of Trent, women religious were all to be cloistered. Now, did some of them escape under the radar? Yes. In the before the Revolution, especially the Sisters of St. Joseph, which were a small group in rural France, they escaped it. Once the French Revolution came, though, and many of the religious orders had to be refounded, they did take on apostolic work. What were the two works that women religious took on first, right away? Schools and nursing. Why did they take on those two? Because they were the only things that women, not religious women, not Catholic women, the only two things that women normally could do outside of the home as professions. That way, originally, the women religious got into the apostolic endeavors. Yes, were there religious at Florissant when they first came? The religious of the Sacred Heart got there a little bit before we did, yes. And they immediately started a school. It was meant to be an Indian school. That's what Philippine Duchesne and the others came for, to use their own terms, which you wouldn't necessarily use today, to convert the savages from their blindness. But immediately it became clear they wanted schools. From the women religious for girls, far be it, because coeducation was absolutely condemned as recently as 1930 in papal documents. Far be it, de facto it was existent, but far be it that they, back in the 1800s and some, should have anything like co-ed schools. But given the exigencies of this country, given the fact that women religious had to have a source of support if they were coming, and they wanted to come to preach the gospel here, given the fact that it had to be schools or nursing or nothing else, they, in parallel paths in many ways, went with the male religious orders in getting schools, hospitals, and so on going. But such things as Catholic hospitals under the supervision or founding of nuns simply didn't exist anywhere else in the world. That was an American invention. There are very few of them in any place in Europe. Now, there are in places like India and Latin America and so on now, but it was only in the United States that that kind of thing happened. We were an adventurous country. We were an adventurous country because of the needs that we had to face what was going on. How did the society react? And there, for that conference that you hope to have in 2014, as a result of it, I think you've got all kinds yet of opportunities for serious scholarship and research. Jesuit archives, not only in this country, but in Rome. There are plenty of material that I still think needs to be gotten out as to what the Society of Jesus did on that second anniversary of the Restoration, when, contrary to absolutely anything you could think of, it succeeded extraordinarily well in this country. Small numbers, no resources, foreigners, hostile environment. What did we do? What did the Society of Jesus over 200 years in this country do that brought about what you all are part of now? Yes?
I don't know if you're able to answer this, but it's a question I've really had the more you talk about practical necessities and exigencies and so on. When you just said, so there were Jesuits and then they realized, well, that's not going to work here. Do you have any sense of when that might have happened in the 19th century? So let's say a Belgian refugee in 1850 comes, and I'm just thinking of the mindset that he has and the way that he sees some problem he's confronting. I would presume that he wouldn't have too much patience for what he sees. Whereas, say, by 1870, maybe that's changed. And I'm just wondering if you have a sense of, if you were breaking it down by decades, when do foreign exiles start becoming American?
Well, the most extraordinarily pragmatic people were those first Belgians. They were willing to face and adapt to things immediately. I mean, for example, they get here in 1823. They get a school in 1828. They get a university charter in 1832. They found a medical school with all lay people, deans, and most of them, except for a few minor situations, Protestant, as part of the university. God knows what Rome thought about that.